The family is demanding answers after the death of their 18-year-old son. Nolan Wells took a boat trip with friends to an island off Mississippi on the 4th of July, but didn't make it back home. His body was found a few days later. Earlier today, his parents, their attorney, Ben Crump, and Reverend Al Sharpton had this message for the public.
He was one black with three young white men who happened to end up with his phone, happened to end up with his keys. This does not smell right.
This notion that, well, he drowned, y'all have, I'm sure, seen all the videos out there. I mean, if he's drowning, nobody sees him drown?
But I do want to say this. I would hope that any parent who, God forbid, would be in our situation, I would hope that you would do the same thing. I would hope that you would ask for any help, receive any help to get answers, because at the end of the day, that's all we want. We just want to know. We just want to know what happened.
Independence Day in Mississippi is a celebration marked by blistering southern heat, the smell of salt water, and the roar of boat engines cutting across the calm emerald waters of the Gulf of Mexico. For families along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, July 4th is an unwritten invitation to escape to the barrier islands, strips of pristine white sand that sit just miles off the mainland, acting as natural buffers against the open sea. Among the most popular destinations for young adults seeking sun, sand, and celebration is Horn Island, an undeveloped, federally protected expanse, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. For 18-year-old Nolan Wells, July 4th, 2024 was supposed to be a rite of passage, a day of carefree camaraderie with friends to celebrate youth and freedom. Instead, it became the prologue to a heartbreaking mystery that would shatter a family, galvanize a community, and thrust a quiet coastal town into the blinding spotlight of national media scrutiny. Nolan Wells was not just another face in the crowd. Described by those who knew him best as an athletic, vibrant, and deeply grounded young man, he had a physical presence that commanded attention. Standing tall and built with the solid frame of an athlete, Nolan was a dedicated football player and an accomplished swimmer. To his family, friends, and teammates, water was a natural element for him, not a hazard. He possessed a healthy respect for the ocean, honed by a lifetime spent growing up near the coast in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. When he packed his gear to head out onto the water that morning, he carried with him the easy confidence of a teenager comfortable in his environment. Yet, within hours, that environment would shift from a place of leisure into a landscape of terrifying ambiguity. According to accounts that would later emerge from the investigation, Nolan traveled to Horn Island by boat alongside a group of friends. The atmosphere on the boat ride out was electric, filled with the typical energy of teenagers looking forward to a holiday beach gathering. Horn Island, on the 4th of July, is traditionally bustling with recreational boaters, campers, and beachgoers anchoring their vessels along the shore, grilling, playing music, and enjoying the sun. It is far from a desolate wilderness on a holiday afternoon. It is a crowded, active social hub. Nolan and his friends joined the collective celebration, anchoring their craft and dispersing onto the sun-drenched sands. For several hours, the day unfolded like countless other summer memories along the Gulf Coast. Laughter, swimming, and socializing against the backdrop of the rolling surf. However, as the afternoon wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the dynamics of the outing began to unravel. What precisely transpired during these late afternoon hours remains one of the most fiercely contested battlegrounds of the entire case. According to statements provided by the friends who accompanied him, a mechanical issue arose concerning their boat. In the intricate, often unforgiving coastal waters, mechanical trouble is a boater's nightmare. But the specific narrative offered to authorities was striking. The friends claimed that amid this logistical crisis, Nolan voluntarily chose to stay behind on the island, while the others attempted to resolve or navigate the boat trouble. Exactly why an 18-year-old would elect to remain stranded on a largely undeveloped barrier island as daylight faded, especially with transportation and safety suddenly compromised, is a question that has haunted Nolan's parents from the very first moment they learned he was missing. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Gulf sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Nolan was no longer with his companions. The initial timeline provided by the individuals who returned to the mainland was fragmented, vague, and plagued by inconsistencies that would later trip alarm bells for investigators and family advocates alike. Hours ticked away in the humid Mississippi night before Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Wansley, received the phone call every parent dreads. It was not a call from emergency services, nor was it a message from law enforcement notifying her of a search operation in progress. Instead, it was the chilling realization that her son was unaccounted for, left behind on a distant island while the rest of the group had returned to the safety of the mainland. The hours immediately following that notification transformed a lingering sense of unease into a full-scale panic. As midnight approached and slipped into the early hours of July 5th, the true gravity of the situation began to crystallize. Why had it taken so long for the friends to alert authorities? Why was an 18-year-old left behind on a holiday weekend without immediate, frantic efforts to secure a rescue? These questions formed the dark, jagged edges of a narrative that investigators would desperately try to piece together in the days that followed. The idyllic backdrop of Horn Island, with its swaying sea oats and gentle waves, now masked a chilling reality. A young man had vanished into the humid coastal air, and the stories told by those who last saw him alive began to fracture under the weight of basic scrutiny. As the sun rose on July 5th, casting daylight over a search area spanning miles of treacherous water and marshland, the official response kicked into gear, but the damage to the timeline was already done. Local authorities, including the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, mobilized Marine units and search teams to scour the island and the surrounding waters. Yet for a family desperate for answers, the initial hours of the search felt agonizingly slow and opaque. The contrast between the carefree morning of July 4th and the grim reality of a missing person search exposed deep fractures in communication between law enforcement and the grieving family. The stage was set for a confrontation between official institutional conclusions and a mother's unyielding intuition, an intuition telling her that the official story of what happened on Horn Island was missing crucial, potentially sinister chapters. The humid morning air of July 6, 2024, hung heavy over the Mississippi Gulf Coast as search and rescue teams continued their grueling grid sweeps across the waters surrounding Horn Island. For nearly 48 hours, the region had been gripped by a collective anxiety, with family, friends, and local volunteers praying for a miracle. Those prayers were shattered mid-morning when a U.S. Park Service ranger patrolling the area made a grim discovery. Floating in the water near the northwest end of Horn Island was the body of 18-year-old Nolan Wells. The physical search had ended, but the psychological and legal battle for the truth was only just beginning. When the recovery was announced, the immediate shockwave rippled through Ocean Springs and beyond. For Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley, the nightmare of their son being missing transformed into the agonizing reality of permanent loss. The body was pulled from the Gulf and transferred to the custody of local authorities, setting into motion the standard protocol for sudden, unattended deaths in Jackson County. However, the operational atmosphere surrounding the recovery was marked by an immediate rigidity that would soon alienate the grieving family. In cases involving young people found in open water, standard investigative procedure demands absolute transparency, meticulous evidence collection, and an open-minded approach to every potential hypothesis. Instead, from the perspective of the family and their legal representatives, local law enforcement appeared to lean toward a premature and simplistic conclusion. Within hours of the body being recovered, early statements and briefings from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department began shaping a definitive public narrative. Authorities strongly suspected that Nolan Wells had drowned, and crucially, they publicly stated that they did not suspect foul play. For investigators working under tight timelines and dealing with the immense pressure of a high-profile missing persons case, pointing toward accidental drowning is often the baseline assumption when a body is pulled from the sea. The logic deployed by local officials was straightforward. Nolan had been left on a barrier island, attempted to navigate the water or elements, and tragically succumbed to the Gulf. To the casual observer, it was a tidy, self-contained explanation for a heartbreaking tragedy. However, criminal investigations are rarely solved by accepting the tidiest narrative. They are built by stress-testing every assumption against hard physical evidence. Almost immediately, the official stance of an accidental drowning collided violently with the glaring physical realities of the victim. Nolan Wells was not an inexperienced swimmer or a casual beachgoer unfamiliar with water safety. He was a robust, athletic 18-year-old who played competitive football and possessed exceptional swimming capabilities. The idea that a physically fit, strong swimming teenager would simply slip beneath the surface and drown in broad daylight on a heavily populated holiday weekend, without anyone noticing, without raising an alarm, and without leaving a trail of survival instincts, defied basic logic for anyone who knew him. Compounding the family's immediate skepticism was the profound lack of communication and transparency from the Jackson County investigators. In the critical window following the recovery of Nolan's body, the family reported feeling shut out of the information loop. Details regarding the exact coordinates of the recovery, the precise condition of his clothing, the personal items recovered with him, and the initial observations of the responding rangers were sparse or entirely withheld. In modern forensic investigations, the first 48 hours are the golden window for preserving trace evidence, interviewing witnesses while their memories are fresh, and securing digital footprints. When communication between law enforcement and a victim's family breaks down this early, it breeds an environment of deep-seated distrust, forcing grieving parents to question whether authorities are aggressively hunting for the truth or simply trying to close a difficult case file as quickly as possible. Furthermore, the initial narrative offered by local officials relied heavily on the uncorroborated statements provided by the group of friends who had accompanied Nolan to the island on July 4th. Investigators had taken preliminary accounts from the peers who claimed a boat mechanical issue forced a separation, leaving Nolan behind. Yet, in the immediate aftermath, there was little public indication that these accounts had been rigorously cross-examined, time-stamped with phone records, or tested against independent witness testimony from other boaters who had been anchored near Horn Island that afternoon. Relying on the narrative of the last people to see a victim alive, without subjecting their timeline to deep forensic interrogation, is a notorious pitfall in criminal investigations, particularly when those individuals may have legal or social motivations to obscure the full sequence of events. As the sun set on July 6th, the chasm between the local authorities' working theory and the family's internal convictions widened into an unbridgeable gulf. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department had penciled in accidental drowning as the working conclusion, viewing the case through the lens of a tragic holiday accident. But for Christine and Elmore Wells Wansley, every piece of missing information, every unanswered question about the timeline, and every inconsistency in the friends' stories pointed toward a much darker possibility. They realized that if they wanted true accountability, they could not rely solely on the initial momentum of a local police department, eager to wrap up an investigation. They needed outside power, independent eyes, and a national spotlight to force a second look at the waters of Horn Island.
Let's bring in CBS News correspondent Skylar Henry. Skylar, what else did we learn from that press conference? We saw Reverend Al Sharpton there. The family hired a civil rights attorney. Did they reveal why they believe this is not only a murder investigation, but a civil rights case?
Well, I think there's just so many questions that are outstanding, Liz, and that is the reason why they're putting so much attention on this case. Obviously, what happened to Nolan Wells was tragic, but what happened? They literally do not know. Based off of what authorities have told us up until this point, at least what they said earlier this week, is that he told friends to leave him behind on Horn Island, which is about 10 miles off of Mississippi's Gulf Coast, to stay behind to meet with a girl. We do not know that to be true. We know that friends have specifically said that that is something that happened. But based off of what the timeline is from law enforcement, is that he was last seen at 3 p.m., told his friends to go back, and no one saw him ever again alive, so much so that his mother put out a missing persons report that evening, and officials all across the board, both land, sea, and in the air, spent a couple of days looking for him and found his body on Monday of this week. Now they're trying to figure out what happened. Where was the failure in communication? They say that his phone and keys were with friends who returned back to the mainland. Of course, he did not. His parents were on CBS Mornings, this morning, saying that they found that storyline to be odd. Why would he say that to his friends, but then leave his phone and keys behind? It just didn't add up, especially saying that this is a place that they've visited time and time again. But he's also not the type to leave without the group. My colleague Anna Schechter had the opportunity to speak with Nolan's parents earlier today during that press conference. She asked about what they feel as if went wrong, and also if anyone has sent any information that has been helping in this investigation.
Nolan was a disciplined, safety-conscious athlete who understood the perils of the Gulf of Mexico. The institutional rush to label the incident an accident felt like a systemic dismissal of Nolan's character, and a shortcut past the hard work required to investigate a complex, unattended death. When investigators treat a suspicious case as a routine tragedy from day one, vital forensic opportunities, such as seizing phones immediately, isolating potential witnesses before stories can align, and treating the recovery site with maximum forensic rigor, are frequently compromised. As the days turned into weeks, the psychological toll on the Wells family deepened into a fierce determination to fight back against the institutional narrative. They realized that waiting passively for local law enforcement to deliver a comprehensive truth was a losing strategy. Christine and Elmore began organizing their own informal information network, speaking with community members, fielding tips from concerned citizens who sensed inconsistencies in the public narrative, and documenting every instance where local authorities failed to provide clear answers. The community of Ocean Springs began to rally around the family, sensing that the official account did not add up. Candlelight vigils morphed into community forums where neighbors voiced growing outrage over the lack of transparency from Jackson County officials. This growing public pressure exposed a dangerous fracture line between the community and the institutions sworn to protect them. When a police department or sheriff's office retreats behind a wall of silence in a high-profile, racially or socially sensitive death, it immediately erodes public trust. Citizens begin to ask uncomfortable questions. If the investigation truly points to a straightforward accident, why the secrecy? Why are basic timeline questions being met with defensive posturing rather than verifiable facts? By failing to maintain an open channel of communication with the grieving family, local law enforcement inadvertently transformed a local tragedy into a national symbol of institutional stonewalling. By mid-July, the family understood they had reached a critical threshold. Local avenues were proving insufficient to pierce the wall of silence, and the official narrative of an accidental drowning was solidifying into an unchallengeable administrative reality unless external force was applied. The agony of losing Nolan was now compounded by the agonizing realization that his case was slipping toward an uninvestigated close. To shatter this silence, The Wells family needed to take the fight out of the local jurisdiction and bring in heavy hitters who could command national attention, challenge local authority, and force the justice system to look deeper into the dark waters of Horn Island. By mid-July 2024, the fight for transparency in Nolan Wells' death transcended the borders of Jackson County, Mississippi, transforming from a localized grieving process into a high-stakes national crusade. Recognizing that local authorities were entrenched in their accidental drowning narrative and unwilling to yield to a heartbroken family's pleas, Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley made a pivotal decision. They realized that local institutional power could only be countered by mobilizing elite national resources. To pierce the wall of silence surrounding Horn Island, the family enlisted one of the most formidable legal forces in modern civil rights history, attorney Ben Crump. The arrival of Ben Crump on the Mississippi Gulf Coast instantly altered the physics of the investigation. Known nationally for representing the families of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, Crump brought an unmatched media megaphone, legal firepower, and a tactical playbook designed specifically to challenge police narratives in suspicious minority deaths. When Crump stepped up to the microphones alongside the Wells family, the message to local law enforcement was unambiguous. The era of operating behind closed doors and issuing brief, dismissive press releases was over. The case of Nolan Wells was no longer just a local sheriff's department file. It was now under the unblinking gaze of the national media and civil rights organizations. With Crump's involvement came crucial logistical and financial backing that ordinary grieving families could never hope to muster alone. Among the most significant early developments was the mobilization of support from high-profile figures and organizations committed to civil justice. Notably, former NFL quarterback and activist Colin Kaepernick stepped forward through his organization to provide critical financial assistance, specifically funding what the family desperately needed to challenge the official narrative, an independent forensic autopsy. In cases where local medical examiners and law enforcement agencies align on a preliminary cause of death, an independent medical evaluation is the single most effective tool to uncover overlooked evidence, dispute premature conclusions, and force a recalibration of the investigation. The introduction of national civil rights pressure also brought powerful institutional allies into the fold. The NAACP quickly amplified its voice, formally calling for a comprehensive review by the United States Department of Justice into the handling of Nolan's case. Prominent public figures, including civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton, media mogul Tyler Perry, and sports commentator Stephen A. Smith, used their immense platforms to broadcast the family's agonizing questions to millions of Americans. Suddenly, the quiet coastal community of Ocean Springs found itself at the epicenter of a national conversation about accountability, institutional bias, and the profound vulnerabilities faced by young black men in recreational or remote settings. For the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, the sudden influx of national scrutiny created an immense institutional challenge. A local agency accustomed to managing investigations without external interference now found its every public statement, procedural delay, and investigative step scrutinized by national legal teams and expert investigators. Press conferences held by Crump and the Wells family dissected the initial police reports line by line, exposing the glaring gaps in the timeline and demanding hard answers to basic questions. Where were the comprehensive cell phone tower dumps of the friends who left Nolan behind? Why hadn't a formal public reconstruction of the boat's mechanical failure been released? And why was an athletic 18-year-old written off as a simple drowning victim before forensic science had even had its final say? Yet, bringing in national legal muscle did not instantly dissolve the local resistance. Instead, it hardened the battle lines. Local officials pushed back against the implication of incompetence or a cover-up, defending the integrity of their initial response while quietly realizing that the political and public relations cost of closing the file prematurely had skyrocketed. The entry of Ben Crump and the backing of figures like Colin Kaepernick ensured that Nolan's story would not quietly fade into the humid Mississippi summer. The stage was set for a scientific and legal showdown, one that would rely not on police assumptions or peer testimonies, but on the unyielding, microscopic truths buried within physical evidence and forensic pathology. When a local investigation locks onto a predetermined theory, the pursuit of objective science becomes the family's ultimate line of defense. For the relatives of Nolan Wells, relying on the preliminary conclusions of Jackson County authorities was no longer an option. Funded by civil rights activist Colin Kaepernick and orchestrated by attorney Ben Crump, the family's legal team took a decisive step. They commissioned an independent forensic autopsy. Performed on July 10, 2024, just days after Nolan's body was recovered from the waters of Horn Island. The examination was handed over to Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist, president of the National Medical Association, and former chief medical examiner of the District of Columbia. When the findings were formally revealed to the public, they fundamentally shattered the tidy narrative local officials had attempted to construct. The independent autopsy report classified both the cause and manner of Nolan Wells' death as undetermined. In the realm of forensic science, an undetermined classification is a profound rejection of a rush to judgment. It is an admission that the physical evidence does not support a clean, accidental conclusion. More importantly, Dr. Mitchell's report explicitly stated that non-accidental factors, meaning foul play, could not be ruled out. This finding was a direct indictment of the Jackson County Sheriff's Department's early public assertions that no foul play was suspected. For a family fighting against institutional dismissal, the independent report provided crucial scientific validation, proving that the mysterious circumstances of Nolan's final hours warranted a deep, aggressive criminal probe rather than a closed-file dismissal. Yet, alongside these chilling possibilities, the independent evaluation exposed critical forensic roadblocks that highlighted the chaotic nature of the initial response. Dr. Mitchell noted several distinct limitations in his examination, chief among them being the condition of the body upon receipt, and most alarmingly, missing anatomical structures. According to the findings presented at a high-profile press conference at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago, certain internal neck structures, including portions of the throat, were missing when the independent pathologist received the remains. Because those vital tissues had not been made available for secondary review, Dr. Mitchell stated that he could not definitively rule out trauma or injury to the neck as a contributing factor or cause of death. The absence of these internal structures instantly ignited intense scrutiny regarding how the initial state autopsy and local handling of the remains were conducted. In forensic pathology, preserving neck structures is standard procedure when evaluating potential manual strangulation, pressure, or trauma during an altercation. The realization that these key tissues were absent during the independent review created a glaring information gap, fueling deep suspicions from the family and legal team. Why were these structures unavailable? What did the initial medical examiners observe before those tissues were separated or processed? These questions transformed the medical debate from a technical disagreement into a fierce institutional standoff over transparency and evidence preservation. Furthermore, the independent autopsy report drew attention to an unexplained physical anomaly, a distinct red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. While the report noted no definitive skull fractures or surface lacerations in that specific area, the presence of this soft tissue discoloration demanded rigorous explanation. Was it the result of post-mortem interaction with underwater debris or marine life? Or was it the silent signature of blunt force trauma sustained prior to entering the water? Dr. Mitchell's findings emphasized that without complete data, microscopic analysis, and full cooperation from state medical examiners, determining the precise origin of that mark was impossible. The release of the independent autopsy report effectively drew a sharp line in the sand. It exposed the immense fragility of the local sheriff department's narrative and proved that the official stance of an accidental drowning was built on premature assumptions rather than exhaustive science. As toxicology reports from the state medical examiner remained pending, and institutional silence continued to frustrate the family, the path forward required confronting the hardest question of all. What actually happened on that boat and on the shores of Horn Island before Nolan Wells ever slipped beneath the waves? While forensic pathology provided the scientific framework that dismantled the official drowning narrative, the human element of the investigation remained an impenetrable maze. In any suspicious death case, the timeline of events leading up to the tragedy is the most critical tool investigators have to separate truth from deception. For Nolan Wells, the timeline provided by the group of friends who accompanied him to Horn Island on July 4, 2024, was not just flawed, it was a shifting landscape of contradictions that crumbled under basic investigative pressure. As attorney Ben Crump, the Wells family, and independent investigators began dissecting the hours leading up to Nolan's disappearance, the narrative offered by his peers began to unravel at the seams.